Hello and welcome to Curiosity Cake, the podcast about ideas for curious minds with big appetites. I'm your host, Lee Delaney. I've just moved into my new house in Harrogate in Yorkshire in the UK and gotten Curiosity Cake on a local community radio station, so a very big welcome to everyone listening on Harrogate Community Radio. On this episode, I'm talking to Brad Warner. Brad is a Zen Buddhist priest, blogger, author and punk rock bass player. We'll be discussing the philosophy and practice of Zen Buddhism. I spent many years practicing Zazen, the form of meditation used in the branch of Zen that Brad teaches. His book Hardcore Zen, Punk Rock, Monster Movies and the Truth About Reality was the first thing I read on Zen. Brad has had a really interesting life, starting off playing in punk bands, moving to Japan, getting a lucky break to work on the Ultraman TV show after writing to the producers and asking for a job, and then discovering his main Zen teacher. Hope you enjoy the conversation and feel inspired to check out Brad's work. Curiosity Cake is still fairly new, so don't forget to tell everyone you know and rate and review the show on your podcast app. But for now, get yourself a cup of tea, grab a fork and dig into a slice of Curiosity Cake. Curiosity Cake. Brad, welcome to Curiosity Cake. Thanks very much for being on. It's really good to have you.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
So this is a topic I have a bit of background knowledge about, and I came across your books. You've got Hardcore Zen, and you were saying about 6 or 7 other books that you've lost track of, count yourself. So we're going to talk about Zen Buddhism. So a good place to start is, what is Zen? But maybe even before that, what is Buddhism?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer because Buddhism is a wide topic. I think a lot of people in the West imagine that Buddhism is one sort of monolithic thing that just is, but it's 2,500 years old, so that's 500 years older than Christianity. So if you know how many different forms of Christianity have sprung up in the last 2,000 years, imagine adding 500 more years to that, and that's what you got in Buddhism. So there's a lot of Buddhisms. Yeah. So the Zen form of Buddhism, like every other form of any religion, claims its legitimacy, from the founder, and claims to go back historically to the Buddha. And as a person who practices it, I think that's probably a legitimate claim, but other people don't. But the idea is that the Buddha, when he was alive 2,500 years ago, taught a very simple form of meditation that was basically sitting still and not particularly trying to make anything happen, not trying to achieve some sort of special state of mind or anything like that. And that's what the Zen tradition has tried to preserve. The Buddhism after the Buddha died became very elaborate with a lot of rituals and ceremonies and philosophy and things. And Zen emerged maybe, history always fails me, 500 to 1,000 years after the Buddha died, as, depending on whose version of the story you want to believe, as a way to try to clear away a lot of the things that had gotten stuck onto the core of Buddhism and get back to the actual meditation practice. So Zen the word Zen just means meditation. It comes from an Indian word dhyana, which was mispronounced by the Chinese as Chan and mispronounced by the Japanese as Zen. So that's why it's called Zen. And yeah, that's it.
That's it in a nutshell.
I always want to give a clever answer, like Zen is the wart on your ass or something. whatever these kind of clever answers you get from clever people. But I usually end up giving a dry, boring history of Zen whenever people ask me that question.
But there's something about Zen where that seems very appropriate as well, rather than an exciting, over the top explanation with all sorts of fancy bells and whistles and fireworks. That actually a bit like the meditation practice in Zen. You sit facing a wall and stare at the wall. I think you yourself talk about it. It can just be really boring.
Yeah, that's I think what most people experience the first time they do zazen. Zazen is the type of meditation we do, which is just a Japanese word meaning seated meditation. It's very, very plain sort of word. And exactly as you describe. You sit down with eyes open. That's one thing that's sort of different from other forms of meditation people might be familiar with, and just stare at the wall. You face the wall and stare at it, and you're not trying to make anything in particular happen, as I said. So the first experience is usually boredom, and people will find the practice often kind of frustrating because they're always wanting to be like, well, what happens next? And there's a cartoon out there that's being shared on the internet with two monks, and one of them says nothing happens next. What happens next? Nothing happens next. You just sit there. But the point of it is to discover the truth of all things by truly and deeply experiencing the most simple thing a human being can do, which is to sit still. I don't know who made that famous quote, but what's that? The inability to sit still is now I've forgotten the whole quote. But somebody says something about the all of the problems of the world are caused by the inability of people to just sit still and be by themselves, which is, or something like that. I saw some study once where they found some psychological study where people would rather endure pain and torture and all sorts of things just to avoid sitting alone by themselves. And that's what Zazen is about. You sit alone by yourself. Even when you're in a group, you're not talking to anybody or interacting in any sort of a standard way with anybody. So you're kind of even by yourself if you're in a room with a bunch of people doing Zazen practice.
Mm-hmm. So really, as a summary of that, Buddhism and the practice of Zen comes down to the idea of just sitting with yourself.
Yeah, kind of. And I mean, put it that way. I mean, that's a perfectly legitimate way to put it, but it sounds like, oh, what are you gonna learn from that? But it's amazing what you can learn from that. That's what really shocked me after the initial experience of it, as I said, was that it was boring, but I could also feel there was some sort of a truth to be had here. And it made sense. If you want to know what the fundamental meaning of life is, well, why not just sit and be alive and directly experience that without looking to something else to tell you about it or to frame it for you or to give you, the answer, or read it in a book or experience it in some sort of a, mind-blowing experience. Well, those things are fine, but if you want to really get down to the truth of things, then sitting still by yourself actually sounds to me very logical.
It really reminds me of the Simpsons episode with the self-help guru shows up in Springfield, and he has a sort of catchphrase or whatever that is something along the lines of "You're a human being, not a human doing," which is obviously a very Simpsons style flippant sort of comment, but there is something about we can. Always looking outside ourselves, always having things to do, stops us really examining what it is to be ourselves.
Yeah, that's it. And finding out what yourself is. I mean, this is a topic I've been trying to study a little bit more in depth, or seeing what people have to say about it, because that idea of the self is really interesting, because we kind of have a notion of what our self is, but mostly if you pay attention to it, or at least this is what I've had from my paying attention to it, you realize you have a self-image of a lot of people. You have an image of your friends, of your parents, your coworkers, whoever you're meeting, and you have the same sort of image of yourself that plays out in your head. It's a bit more detailed than the image that you have of friends and coworkers, but it's the same sort of thing. It's a set of assumptions about who you are, and if you actually start sitting with who you are, it starts to challenge those assumptions. It doesn't, for most people that doesn't happen immediately, the first time they sit or anything, but after a little while of doing it, your assumptions about who you are start to seem questionable. And continuing it a few years, then for me, it raised a lot of questions about the very nature of reality. A lot of things that I had assumed were true started to show themselves to be just assumptions that I'd carried around with me and not have much to do with the truth of things at all. This is quite interesting. It goes from boring to interesting after a while.
How long does that take?
I don't know. For me, it took a few years. I had a good teacher right from the start, and that's useful, because if you're going to embark in a practice like this that literally offers you nothing, one of my Japanese teachers was kind of famous for saying Zazen is good for nothing. It's this practice that gives you nothing. No promises are made of this, and so if you're going to embark on that sort of thing, you have to have, or at least in my case, I think most people's cases, you have to have a certain amount of trust. And I trusted this teacher that I had at the beginning, and an American guy named Tim McCarthy. And I just did it based on this sort of trust that it was worth doing this useless practice. And after a while, I found out he was right. I don't know how long. Immediately, it was clear to me that this was worth doing, because it helped. I was a teenager. I was just getting into my first or second year at university, so I had a lot of stress and things and all the things that go on in a person's life at that age, and it immediately helped with a lot of that. So I could see that there's some usefulness in sitting quietly, once every morning and once every evening, and doing this on a regular basis. But it took a few years before the deeper levels of it started to become apparent. I was reading about it in books and going, oh, that's interesting what that guy says, but I haven't experienced anything like that. But after a few years, I started to go, oh, that thing I read in the book, that's true.
Yeah, I read quite a few books around Zen while I was practicing, and at some point I just stopped, because you keep reading people talking about the experiences of it further down the line that I wasn't having yet, because I wasn't experienced enough and deep enough into it. And it just felt like, perhaps there, like you're describing, is there an element of faith there as well, that you need some amount of faith to stick with the practice because you think there's going to be something later down the line?
Yeah, my first teacher used to say, if you want to practice Zazen, it takes an equal amount of doubt and faith. And I think that's probably true, because the faith aspect of it kind of keeps you going. Faith meaning, I think, trust that you're not being lied to. And if you have a good teacher, that can help with that. And doubt is good, because you don't want to get sort of culty about it, or too you can get too into Zen. They call it the stink of Zen, when you get too far into it, and you just start sort of believing everything that you read in books. The books like the ones you mentioned, one of the first books I ever read about Zen was called The 3 Pillars of Zen. Yeah. And not to disparage the book, I haven't read it for years, but it's sort of, one of the features of that book is that the author, Philip Kapleau, decided to do something that that wasn't ordinarily done, which is to have people recount their so-called enlightenment experiences, their experiences of like this profound thing that's supposed to happen if you do Zazen. And so the descriptions are very flowery and exciting. And that kind of affected my practice because I kept waiting for that big exciting moment to happen, and it kept not happening. Day after day, month after month, year after year, I wasn't having those exciting experiences. And I gave up on the practice a few times just because I thought, well, I've had enough of this. The thing that always brought me back to it was I never felt better during the times that I gave up on Zen practice. It always made things worse, maybe not unbearably worse, but it just, the noise and, garbage in my head, the level would start to rise day after day as I didn't do the Zen practice. And then I finally realized I better start doing that again because my, mind is too full of this stuff.
Yeah, well, we're talking about faith there and trust, but you're also talking very much about giving the practice a go and through your own experience of it, that reinforcing that trust to keep going.
Yeah, it did. It just, there was something about it. And the initial stages of practice for most people are never the big exciting moments that you sometimes read about in books. Those happen, but they also, those sort of moments can also be a bit of a burden too. But just trying it out was the main thing. I did it. I meet people. My first experience of Zazen really was doing Zazen. Tim, when he taught that class, had us sit Zazen on the very first day because it was a university class, but he wanted to give us some sort of practical experience. And he never had us do it again during the class because it was, an academic sort of study of Zen rather than a class where you were to practice Zen. But having had the experience of it, I was like, okay, now I have some inkling at least of what these things I'm reading are based on. It's all based on the practice. I think Kodo Sawaki or someone said all of the philosophy of Buddhism is a footnote to Zazen. It's just an attempt to explain this practice. And one of the things that people go wrong with is they try to understand it by reading about it. And you can understand sort of the intellectual underpinnings or explanations of the practice by reading about it. But unless you experience it, it's like reading about a sport. You could read about football all you want, but if you've never actually played, then your experience isn't quite the same as somebody who actually plays the game. It's a whole different thing. And then you realize, oh, that's what the book is describing. But people somehow miss that when it comes to Zen practice sometimes.
I think you're talking about cults there. Oh, hang on, that's going down a bit of a random tangent. I was thinking about in terms of fundamentalism, and Buddhism seems to have a bit of a different. It almost gets off lightly when it comes to religion in the West. So we have quite we have a sort of militant atheist movement or strong atheist movement, secular societies, Christianity very much under attack. But Buddhism in a way gets off lightly, and I see people talk a lot about Buddhism almost as not a religion, like they almost describe it as like a psychology, or the classic I'm spiritual but not religious kind of thing. But how much of that is just a particular perception or a particular approach to Buddhism that comes to the West?
It's hard to say. The initially when Buddhism started to be embraced by Westerners, it was sort of presented as, well, it's not a religion. It's, sometimes people would say it's a philosophy. Sometimes people would compare it to psychology and things like that. And it's because in the East, in general, that hard division between what is religion and what is not religion never became an issue the way it became in the West. There's a whole historical reason for that. The church was very strong in trying to tell the sciences, what was true. In the West, they had that problem, and science couldn't advance as long as it was being held back by these religious dogmas and doctrines. So we in the West solved that problem by making a hard line between, this is religion over here and this is science and everything else over there. But it was never, that particular problem never really arose in the societies, in the eastern half of the world. So you can say that it's not exactly a religion in the Western sense of religion. But then you have the backlash to that, which I've seen more recently, of people who traveled in Asia and they go, "Oh no, Buddhism is definitely a religion," and there are forms of Buddhism in which Buddha is worshipped as a god, in which people believe in miracles and have the same sort of a blind faith or even kind of a fundamentalist attitude. Those do exist. The forms of Buddhism that have become popular in the West, though, are by and large the other forms of Buddhism which don't view it that way, which view, for example, the Buddha as a human being, who was an extraordinary human being, but he wasn't supernatural in any way, and they kind of have a strong. It's not that the supernatural is denied so much as there's a strong sense of skepticism towards it, especially in the Zen tradition. There's a funny Dogen, who is the guy who founded the form of Zen that I do. He has a funny piece of writing in which he talks about miracles. The title of the piece is Miracles, and throughout this piece, he recounts a bunch of supposed miracles attributed to the Buddha and his disciples and things. And he never categorically denies that they happened. He just says that the only place a miracle of that sort can happen is within the great miracle, which he describes as ordinary existence itself. If you don't have the foundation of ordinary existence, or what you think of as ordinary existence, and which you tend to ignore or discount, then you can't have a miracle. So what you should really pay attention to is ordinary existence, and you don't need to pay attention to miracles and things like that. So that sort of attitude runs through the Zen tradition, and it makes it hard to classify it as a religion in the sense that we normally think of as religions.
And is that partly what inspires the idea of the Four Noble Truths, that kind of central tenet of Buddhism, is the main teachings?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the Buddha's original formula, that he, all life is suffering. The cause of suffering is desire. Cutting off desire is the way to cut off suffering. And the Noble Eightfold Path, which is another formula, is the way to cut off desire. I could probably go into a whole reason why my own teacher, the one who ordained me, didn't like that version of the Four Noble Truths, but that's the basic version that you hear, and it's quite practical. I mean, that's the thing. One of the things that really interested me in Zen from the outset was the practicality of it. It just wasn't about anything that I couldn't, at least try out for myself. It wasn't about what happens after I die, for example, or about what happens in some other, higher realm or something like that. It was very much, about dealing with life as I could experience it here and now.
Yeah, it's what's going on for you at this moment in time.
Yeah.
But through the practice of Zazen, that's how you look to move down the layers to try to work that out.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good way to look into what your life actually is. That this silent practice in which you're not trying to make something else happen. You're just looking constantly at here's the reality of the moment, and the reality of the moment is experienced different ways at different moments, but there's a fundamental undercurrent running through it, which is very mysterious. This is the thing. There's something which we provisionally call self, which seems to run through all of the experiences. And there's a whole lot of philosophical debate about whether this self is unchanging or not. And this is, gets very arcane within the Buddhist literature and very complicated. But what you can say is there's something experiencing all of this. But what is it? And is there really a division between myself and what I experience, or is there just one sort of whole that we, with the mind, divide up into, self and other, or me and my experiences, or me and my memories and all of this? The more you look at it, at least this has been my experience, the more that core something sort of becomes more and more mysterious as time goes by, until you realize, well, I can't really say anything about that, but it does seem to it seems like the basis for all of this experience is me. But what am I? I make a lot of assumptions about what I am, and people can tell me what I am, but I go, well, when I look at it just quietly, none of those assumptions seem to be very true.
And if I remember rightly, I think from my reading, maybe the main kind of philosophical ideas, or as you're describing there, the questioning of the idea of the self, which I thought kind of led to a bit of a conclusion that there was no self, that maybe distinguishes Buddhism from Hinduism in some way. And then the other idea of the impermanence idea.
Mm-hmm. Well, these are interesting questions, and I don't know how far to go with them, because one of the things I've noticed is, as I've been, Buddhism separated itself from Hinduism early on with this doctrine of anatman, and atman is usually understood to mean self, and an is a denial, so no self. And in the Bhagavad Gita, the big scripture in Hinduism, there's this description of the self that's this permanent, unchanging thing that lives within your body but isn't your body, and then departs from the body and enters a new body, at the time of death, and so on. And the Buddha rejected that and taught this doctrine of no self. On the other hand, as I've been kind of reading further developments in Hinduism over the past few months, I just developed this kind of interest in trying to see what that was all about. You find that the way they use Atman in more sort of developed philosophical forms of Hinduism isn't really isn't that ghost that lives in your body and jumps out at the time of death. It's something more like what the Buddhists are talking about. Dogen used this Japanese word jiko, and jiko is just a normal word that you use for self, but he invested it with this sort of mystical sense. What is self? So yeah, the Atman as sort of an ego self, that isn't real. That's a fiction that we create for ourselves. And then believe in, and then try to defend and work ourselves up about if somebody's insulted it, or if it's not rich enough, or if it's not having the sort of meditative experiences we want it to have, and all sorts of other things we can fret about. Well, that's the self that we want to drop. But at the same time, when you are deeply practicing, who's practicing? That becomes a kind of an interesting question that you can keep looking at and looking at and looking at. But the answer is never clear. I mean, it is clear in some sense, but it's not something you can easily put into words and describe.
If we come back then to some of these big experiences that you talk about that people kind of claim to have or claim is some sort of goal. You're mentioning enlightenment there, and that comes up, a lot in the books that I used to read, but it comes up a lot just across not just Buddhism, but that kind of wider kind of New Age spiritual movement and things. So many people you see claiming to be enlightened, people that have read a couple of books and started meditating last week claiming that they're enlightened. What is this idea of enlightenment?
Well, in the Zen tradition, at least in the Soto Zen tradition, there's this idea that sitting zazen is enlightenment. That was Dogen's big catchphrase that he'd use a lot in his writings. And when you first do zazen, as I mentioned earlier, your first experience is usually boredom. In fact, your 750th experience is usually boredom too, and so you go, well, this doesn't seem like enlightenment, I don't seem to be enlightened. My teacher used to put it that there was two kinds of enlightenment. There's first enlightenment and there's second enlightenment. So there's this, this initial sense that sitting zazen itself is enlightenment, although we tend to not notice the ways in which it's enlightenment. And then after you do that practice for a number of years, you can have this second sort of enlightenment in which my teacher described as solving philosophical problems, which I always like because it's very, he was very into just making the most dry, nuts and bolts sort of explanations of Zen possible. That seemed to be his shtick, in life.
Makes it sound like you can go and write some great essay questions and answers really quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, just it's solving philosophical problems. Yeah, but it's not really like that though.
Yeah.
You just sort of see the truth of things. But along the way, as you practice, there are experiences that happen, and some of those are useful, and some of them are deeply profound. But it's sort of like what Dogen says about miracles. The only place that these deeply profound or insightful sort of experiences happen is within this sort of mundane world. So we have to come back and see what the mundane world is all about, because that is actually telling us more than those deeply insightful experiences. Although most of us, myself included, can go by, without noticing how much more we are deriving from even the most ordinary of experiences. So yeah, when people claim to be enlightened, that's usually a red flag. I very rarely will pay any further attention to anybody once I've heard their claim to be enlightened. It's usually sort of a trap. Your mind will kick up whatever it can to justify its prominence in your experience, and sometimes what it kicks up is exactly what you had hoped an enlightenment experience would be. So it triggers all these things to happen, and then you go, oh wow, that's it. But that's really kind of pointing you in the opposite direction of where you ought to be going a lot of the times, and sometimes it takes even the profound and real so-called enlightenment experiences that are not, just a hallucination or something like that. Those, most people who have them, it takes them a while to get over them. You have to get over them, and once you get over them, then you're okay. You have to kind of not to say that they aren't valuable or useful or things you can learn from, because they can be, but you also have to leave them behind.
So in what ways do you think, because obviously you've practiced Zen and Zazen for a long time, in what ways has that changed you yourself, or has it even?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I do feel it's changed me in profound ways, but it's difficult to know. I did this. This is going back a number of years, but at one time I was trying to be a novelist, before I hit on the idea of writing Zen books. And one of the novels I wrote, the main character I created was me, who had never encountered Zen in his life, and I just sort of created this character based on what I thought I would be like, and he was a mess. He was terrible, And the more I wrote this character, though, the worse he got, because I just have to put aside anything that I wrote for him to encounter. I had to put aside anything that I derived from my Zen practice, and have him encounter it without that. And it was awful. So I can. That's my suspicion, is that if I hadn't done this practice, I was, suffering from deep depression, when I first started. I never had the money, since I was out on my own, to spend on a psychiatrist or psychiatric treatment. So I wasn't, when I was younger, clinically diagnosed, but I'm pretty sure I would have ended up medicated had I gone to a professional, in my 20s, for the kind of depression that I had all the time. And that, the Zazen has really helped deal with that, although it's hard to say exactly in what way. I can sort of see depression come up and go, okay, there's that thing, without ascribing it to a self that is depressed, like I am depressed. It's more like, okay, here comes depression along the way, like a windy day or something, and then it passes after a while, and I'm not, I don't identify myself with that. So that's been good. And then there are the sort of more mystical sounding things of having this developing understanding of the world I live in, which I find to be quite different from the way most people, the world most people seem to assume we're living in. Even though it looks, I assume, the same to me as it does to everybody else. Which, there goes. This is one of those like stoner questions. There's like I'm always amused by the questions people ask when they're, really stoned, and the questions Zen people ask are kind of similar. Like, are you seeing the same sort of world that I'm seeing, man? But it's a legitimate question. But Zen sort of has this balance. You have this. You're kind of putting yourself in a space where you can have an experience that people might describe as mystical or deeply profound, but you're also trying to maintain the other foot in the normal world and not get, not just launch off into the stratosphere as some sort of meditative practices will encourage you to do. To always keep, a foothold in conventional reality, even as you tend to lose your belief in the way most people frame conventional reality. This is the one of the things that people can notice this in is often if you see a statue of the Buddha. This is not every statue of the Buddha, but quite a few of them will show him putting one hand touching the ground, and that's to symbolize his commitment to this kind of that sort of practice of keeping a foot in reality. Well, you're trying to discover reality, but you're also accepting what people describe as reality as being part of that. Now it just sounds weird.
Well, it's bringing me back to a good question, I think, around like an afterlife, that kind of spiritual realm sort of questions, and God. So does Zen have ideas around, a great creator, or I think people really associate like reincarnation and rebirth with Buddhism.
Yeah.
What is Zen's position on those?
Well, yeah, you can find all sorts of positions. In one of my books, I was writing about Dogen, and I think the chapter is titled, "Did Dogen believe in reincarnation, and does it matter if he did or not?" It's a question I put to myself, because Dogen is a very interesting writer, because there are parts of his writing where he categorically denies reincarnation in no uncertain terms. You can find these sections where I've seen people try to read them other ways, but I'm like, you really can't legitimately read this passage and see it as a person who believes in reincarnation, because he's saying, firewood becomes ash. It does not return to being firewood again. Similarly, human beings do not return to life after they die, so things like that. But then in other sections of his writing, he's talking about what happens in the realms following your death. And he talks about different, masters and people who are reincarnated. And so it's difficult to really resolve that easily, but Dogen is contradictory all the time. Mm-hmm. So I wrote a whole book called "There Is No God and He Is Always With You," which was my attempt to write something about whether Buddhists believe in God, because there's no sort of creation myth. I have to be careful, because if you dig deep enough, you can find creation myths associated with Buddhism, but they're not given great importance. Any Christian knows that God created the world in 7 days, but you can find Buddhists who studied for years and never have come across the Buddhist creation myths. So they're not given a place of great importance, although they do exist. Mm-hmm. So there isn't this idea of God creating the universe or something like that. But if you read certain Buddhist writings, particularly Dogen, in a different light, you can go, well, he's not talking about that sort of God, but he's saying, for example, we are the tools that it uses within the universe, to experience the universe. And this it that he's referring to, well, he's kind of giving a sense that there is something larger than us as individuals, of which we are a part, and which is a living thing and is not, there are a lot of people who try to describe Buddhism as atheism, and I don't think that's really true. It's not a denial of God so much as a kind of refusing to sort of anthropomorphize God, but accepting that maybe there is something much bigger than that. And the reincarnation thing, of course, a lot of people are attracted to Buddhism because of reincarnation in the West, which is kind of ironic, because the Westerners tend to hear about reincarnation and go, oh, good, I get to live again. Whereas the way reincarnation is framed in Buddhism and in Hinduism as well is as something you want to avoid.
It's more like, oh no, I've got to live again.
Yeah. You don't want to be reincarnated. So the part of the teaching of reincarnation is that it's an undesirable thing. That what you really want to do is disappear, and you go, oh, is that what I want to do? if you're from that kind of Western mindset, it can be kind of a shock to see it put that way.
Oh, there's so much stuff I want to ask you, because how you got into Zen and your experience with Japan, and playing in a punk band and things is so interesting. But I'm wondering, would you actually encourage people to practice Zen? Like, would you say to people, oh, you should go and practice Zen, it's great?
I think so. I mean, I give people sort of mild encouragement. I try to be available for people who have already decided that that's what they want to do, rather than sort of encourage them to do it, such as as that might be. I think there's an old formula in Zen that you don't answer any question about Zen practice until the person has asked it 3 times. So you put them off the first 2 times, and if they ask it a 3rd time, then you answer it. And I don't know anybody who sticks to that literally, but I always sort of use that as a rule of thumb. I try to judge whether people are actually serious about practice before I'm going to, sort of encourage them to do it, because it may not be for everybody, but I think anybody who wants to learn it and try it out for themselves can derive some good from it, and it can be very useful. The dog is going crazy.
There's something that I always find really refreshing about that approach that seemed to generally be across Zen and maybe Buddhism in general, of it's not for everyone, but give it a go and see how you find it for yourself.
Yeah, I think that's really it, and that's the best thing to do. It's one of these things you have to want to do it, and there's no sense proselytizing. Although Buddhism is considered one of the quote missionary religions, in that it's not like Judaism or some of these religions where they're like, you have to be born into it. Mm-hmm. There is a certain amount of encouragement of others to join, but at the same time, you want to temper that with you don't want to be evangelical about it. You're just sort of saying, here it is. If you're interested in it, this is where you can find it, but not necessarily trying to recruit people into it.
And does Buddhism have any kind of that history of that evangelical reaching out, trying to almost like conquer other places, make them Buddhist, in a way that Christianity or Islam might?
Not really. Not that I've ever been able to find. I actually asked myself that question a couple of years ago and did a bit of research and couldn't find it. I mean, there's a sort of a sense of wanting to spread the faith in a way and sending people out to kind of teach it in people like Bodhidharma famously, going from India into China to try to teach the Chinese, but he wasn't trying to start a movement. He just sort of was, ironically, he started a movement with just 5 people in his lifetime that he taught in China, but that, ended up spreading quite widely throughout China. But that idea of conquering places in the name of Buddhism doesn't really exist. I know there's some stuff going on in Myanmar, but lately, but I feel like that's more using Buddhism as an excuse to plant some political thing, or maybe that's the way it always is when those things happen.
Yeah, I think there's some issues with China and Tibet and the choice of the Panchen Lama. I think that's probably a few years ago. But that's
that gets very complicated too.
Bodhidharma. I'm remembering something. Was he the person who's meant to have cut off his eyelids so that he could stay awake while doing zazen for long periods of time? Yeah.
I don't think he really did that. All those legends are sort of folk tales about him.
Got it. That's one of my favorite. That's one of my favorite ones.
But yeah, he was. I think that legend was derived from the fact that he was very serious about meditation practice. I don't think he really cut off his eyelids, but there's another one that his arms and legs fell off because he meditated so long. I don't think that would even happen if you. So there you go.
Brad, that was fantastic. Coming up to time, I've got to stop, but I could go on. So thanks very much for your time. Maybe you won't want to do this, but do you want to tell people how they can find out more about you? Maybe how they can ask you to be their teacher, perhaps?
Sure. I mean, I keep a blog at hardcorezen.info. So it's .info because we didn't get .com. And that has links to everything I do. I haven't been writing on the blog as much as I used to, and I do a lot more YouTube videos. So there's a YouTube channel, youtube.com/hardcorezen, where you can find videos, and I do about 3 a week. So you can find me there, and there's always links to, if people want to write to me, those are always in the blog or in the description of the YouTube videos.
Yeah, and I'll have those links in the show notes as well. And then lastly, Zero Defects, your punk band, you were saying that they're still going. Do you have anything coming up for them?
Well, nothing planned. Although they just this week sent me. They're all in Ohio, and I'm living in California, and they just sent me a song they've been working on that they wanted my contributions to, and this is the third one we've done recently. So I imagine once it becomes possible to do live performances, we'll want to set something up. So
a slow build up to
just
something
watch,
exciting.
Yeah, watch the blog or something. I'll announce it if we once we get sorted out.
Brad, that's awesome. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Remember to rate and review the show on your podcast app and spread the word. And get in touch on Twitter, through the website or Instagram, and let me know what topics you'd like to hear in the future. Bye for now.
Curiosity Cake.